That's a good point. It says that if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. This is another quote from David Guzik. This is a pretty Guzik-heavy thing I'm stealing here.
Galatians, we could call it.
What will keep us from bearing one another's burdens and fulfilling the law of Christ? Pride, which is when anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing. It is often pride that keeps us from ministering to one another as we should. It's interesting, the idea here of deceiving yourself, even the possibility that you can deceive yourself, and that probably, more than likely, a lot of us are deceiving ourselves about this very issue.
Speak for yourself.
That we are something when we're nothing, and it's something that I think the idea is that this is a pretty interesting thing. I think possibly the idea is that he's saying here that we are something, that we are. It's not that we are nothing. I mean, it's not that we don't have value before God. I mean, we're made in the image of God. I mean, the Bible is about God's love for us, and so it's certainly not that we are nothing intrinsically, but that our somethingness, I guess if you will, really comes from God, and therefore to think that we are too important to really sacrifice yourself and get down and dirty and help your neighbor with their trouble or whatever it is a deception. And so we should pinch ourselves and think and look ourselves in the mirror, next time we are about to walk away from some task that could really help someone, and remember that it's God that gives us our breath, and that it's, this is how He wants us to be to one another, to really help one another. And this seems to be self-evident after getting to know the Bible. It's a theme that permeates the entire 66 books. Here are a few examples of some quotes. Proverbs 3, verse 34. He mocks proud mockers, but gives grace to the humble. Isaiah 5, verse 21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Mark 9, verse 35. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and servant of all. Romans 12, verse 16. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 18. Do not deceive yourselves. If any one of you thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool so that he may become wise. 1 Peter 5, verses 2 through 6. Be shepherds of God's flock, that is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not greedy for money, but eager to serve, not lording over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of glory that will never fade away. Young men, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, and He may lift you up in due time. Mike?
Okay. Galatians chapter 6, verse 4. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone, and not in his neighbor. So with the context of the previous verse in view, Paul is telling us to test our own work. Now we need to unpack this statement a little bit here. Now the Greek word dokimazeto is where we get the word test. The specific action speaks of examining or testing with a little bit of a connotation of like an ordeal to prove or approve something. Almost like you're putting something on an examination table and, prodding it. The Bible Knowledge Commentary says it like this, and I really like this. Something must be laid aside if a believer is to be a burden bearer, and that is conceit, an attitude that breeds intolerance of error in others and causes one to think he is above failure. The remedy for self-conceit is found in verse 4. Everyone is told to test, or dokimazeto, you also see this in 1 Peter 1:7, his own actions. This means that rather than comparing himself with others, he should step back and take an objective look at himself and his accomplishments. Then he can take pride in himself and what God has done, over what God has done in and through his life. You also might check Romans 12, verse 3 on that. The Greek word kauchema rendered pride here also interestingly means personal exaltation and not necessarily like sinful pride. So it's good to keep those two Greek words in mind when reading this verse. Dokio mozeto and kauchema. All right.
Yeah, I'm totally going to keep those in mind. Well, I actually had trouble with this verse. It seemed a little tough at first. But let every man test his own work, and then he shall have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. So, but that really did help, thinking that it was like that. It's like test or examine yourself, and I kind of got the idea that it was sort of like, it's all about good stuff. I mean, really, looking at all this stuff and saying, well, is that what I'm doing? And you can get convicted of it. You're like, well, I'm really not doing that or whatever. But then if you feel like, but that's the whole point, is to test it. And if you do are doing that, then you can rejoice in yourself alone. It's kind of like an inward rejoicing and not in another, not to boast. So if the Galatians follow this path that this letter is kind of set before them, that they will have a genuine reason to boast, and Paul shows them that they should not. One quick thing from this verse is kind of looked at a little bit like talking to a minister by Luther. He says, "Let a minister be faithful in his office. Let him not seek his own glory or look for praise. Let him desire to do a good work and preach the gospel in all its purity. Whether an ungrateful world appreciates his effort is to give him no concern, because after all, he is in the ministry, not for his own glory, but for the glory of Christ." Mike?
That reminds me of a quote that, both you and I like Spurgeon. Spurgeon said one time, he was speaking to an audience of ministers. He said, "Do you think you're an inch high?" He says, "You're too tall. You're supposed to be nothing, and just take pride in what God has done to you, done in and through you." And that's really, I think, a good way to sort of keep this verse in view. It's much more clear from the Greek. Let's see, Galatians chapter 6, verse 5. "For each will have to bear his own load." Now, on first glance, we see that if we take both this verse and verse 2 a little bit out of context, they appear to contradict each other. Now, what's needed is a closer look at the languages, specifically Greek. The key appears to be the word here translated load in English. Load here and then burden in verse 2. The word for load in verse 2, or burden, is baros, referring to a load so heavy that a person just cannot carry it, especially with the idea of oppressive suffering, perhaps borrowed from the Hellenistic world. Like you were running and somebody just ran up to you and put 500 pounds on you and you just collapsed in a heap. That's really what the word baros sort of entails. In verse 5, the word is fortion, which refers to cargo, perhaps like a military bag of equipment or the stuff one would need to run a race. So in the first, the load is one that just cannot be carried by the person. And in the second, the load is what we are required to bear, perhaps even with an eye towards our proving before the judgment seat of Christ. This really has a whole eschatological flavor to it. Some people really, some commentators really rely on that.
Right. Well, I see that kind of like the first one, and again, as you mentioned in the Greek, is a really important part. It is a totally different word for bearing, and one is to bear, as we were talking about, bear another's infirmities, to bear their sins, all their troubles, and another thing. The second one is something that they can't bear. In context, we'll see in that this is this kind of bearing is the judgment seat of Christ. Vincent Word studies in that we're all going to stand before the throne of God, and they've got to bear their own burdens in that regard. Mm-hmm. They've got their own that to bear. Mm-hmm. But as far as the other bearing was in the earlier verse was spoken in terms of bearing somebody's weights. Vincent Word study says it this way: Paul means no one will have occasion to claim moral superiority to his neighbor. Each man's self-examination will reveal infirmities enough for his own, even though they may not be the same as those of his neighbor. His own burdens will absorb his own attention and will leave no time to compare himself with another. So every man has to answer to God for his own actions. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad." And this is, and that's actually, if it becomes a little bit more, if you connect it to the verse 4 there, it seems that makes a little more sense. Let every man prove his own work, and then shall rejoice in himself and not in another, for every man will bear his own burden. So, go ahead.
The context, really, of verse 4 really sheds a lot of light on verse 5.
Yeah.
Galatians chapter 6, verse 6. One who is taught the word must share all good things with the one who teaches. And this is something that I feel is actually pretty important. We are freed by the law from having to be made right in God's eyes by giving the tithe. There is, in my opinion, little biblical support for having to give a set amount of money to the one who teaches. However, as you grow more and more in the Lord and increasingly become taught in the Word, you find yourself wanting to sow to others. It really becomes an inside-out thing. Now, while this may be a call to the serious Christian, which is certainly in view in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 6, one thing that's often missed is the word here, the verb of koinoneion. The stem does not just mean money, it means a general sharing of goods, both material, physical, and spiritual. Pray for those who are you pastors and teachers. Pray for ministries that you have benefited from, both currently and in the past. Just pray for the leaders and authority as well. For the one who is taught the word must share all good things with the one who teaches.
Yeah, that's a good point, about praying for your pastors and stuff. One of the reasons that's a good thing is because if a pastor's head of a church, Satan pretty much knows how to take down those kinds of systems. If you put one guy on top, all he's got to do is to focus his attack on that person and try to get them to fall in something, because then he can take down the whole thing. So they're under a lot of attack a lot of times, and so it's really good to pray for them for that reason. It's a lot of times why a lot of them fall, unfortunately, even the best of intentions, sometimes under the weight of that temptation and whatever Satan's thrown at them. But anyway, this theme that let him that is taught in the word, the King James here says, communicate unto him that teaches in all good things. It's this theme called burden bearing that we're in, and he kind of shifts gears here to talk about financial support for those that teach and preach. And it's kind of weird talking about it if you don't want to sound like a TV preacher or something, but Martin Luther has this great quote about it. He says, "These passages are meant to benefit us ministers. I must say I do not find much pleasure in explaining these verses. I am made to appear as if I am speaking for my own benefit." This is basic, though. Sometimes it's a neglected spiritual principle. For those that feed and bless you spiritually, you should be supporting them financially. Paul repeats this principle in several other places. He says, "If we have sown spiritual things unto you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things?" In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 11, it says, "Even so the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel." In 1 Corinthians 9:14, it says, "Let the elders who rule well be accounted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and in doctrine." And in 1 Timothy 5, verse 17, it says, "If you trust them with your spiritual health, you should also trust them as to steward the gifts of God's people." In Luke 16:11, I think I'm going to get those verses backwards there, but there are many places in the Bible that talks about this in terms of where our giving should go as Christians. The poor and the needy mentioned a ton of times, orphans and widows, helping in times of crisis, which is why a lot of the churches would help in famine. So there's all of these kind of needs that are out there, and these that we can happily bear as the Lord leads us. But these passages make it clear that at least some of that should be given to the place where you are learning spiritually.
Mm-hmm. Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Good stuff.